Former John Jay College president Jeremy Travis now works for Arnold Ventures, a philanthropy where he is executive vice president of criminal justice. So in the mid-1990s, tell us what you're doing.
I was nominated and confirmed to be the director of the National Institute of Justice in the Clinton administration. And that is the research arm of the Justice Department. It was at a time, just to put it in context, when rates of violence were going through the roof. The country was really in panic. And one of the tasks we had under the '94 Crime Act was to conduct research on gun violence from the Justice Department. At the same time, the Centers for Disease Control, which had established a National Institute for Research on Injury Prevention, was starting a research program on firearms as an injury question. And so we were both operating, in essence, in tandem on one of the critical issues facing the country then and now, which is gun violence. And a study was published coming out of CDC showing that the mere presence of a firearm in the home significantly increased the likelihood of suicide and other injury.
This is very important because what your research shows is having a gun around actually seems to have the effect of making somebody more likely to commit suicide.
It's a risk. But this finding that having a gun in the home increased the risk of injury just went to the core of one of the central tenets of the NRA, which is that guns are okay at home.
So what does the NRA do when this research starts coming out?
So the NRA went to one of their Republican congressmen, a fellow named Jay Dickey from Arkansas, and they introduced an amendment that carries his name, saying that the funding to the CDC could not be used to promote gun control. So that was interpreted not to limit advocacy, but to stop research. And the way the NRA made sure that message was clear was Congress reduced the budget of CDC by $2.6 million, which was the amount of money that was being spent for firearms research. Exact same amount. So from 1996 until 2017, the Dickey Amendment was interpreted as being a prohibition against research by the federal government on gun violence through the CDC. And this is what we refer to as the two-decade evidence desert. And here we were basically thwarted as a country from trying to understand what would be effective at saving lives.
Then in 2019, there is some funding provided. What changes?
Intervening events, we have significant, unfortunately sort of frequent mass shootings and gun violence. And then there's a massacre at Parkland, at the high school in Florida. And the students at Parkland, much to their credit, started rallying and organizing with an agenda. And on their agenda was restore federal funding for research at CDC. But this became a rallying cry, and President Trump, much to his credit, issued an interpretation by his Secretary of HHS that that amendment did not preclude research. That was then codified into statute by Congress, and then Congress started to appropriate funds. $25 million, which is nothing, half of it to NIH, half of it to CDC, but at least it was opening the spigot for research on gun violence that had been closed.
But still, one of the things you point out is staggering to me, the difference in how much we spend. So you say, this is from your research, the U.S. spends about $7,000 on research per life lost to sepsis, about $1,000 per life lost on motor vehicles, and for lives lost to guns, per person we spend $63 per life lost.
Shameful, isn't it? We have a lot of lost time to make up for. So the current moment is a moment when at least we should be significantly increasing the federal investment in research on gun violence.
So a lot of what you're trying to get is facts, evidence, research,
right,
data. One thing we're noticing in America these days is sometimes that doesn't seem to matter. We're sort of living in a post-truth polarized environment where people, for almost reasons of tribal belonging, believe or don't believe. It feels more like it's about faith than evidence. Do you think evidence and research could change this?
This is climbing a very steep hill. I think we recognize that. When it's hard for people to believe in climate change or in the efficacy of vaccines, where there's that type of science backing up a policy, it'll be hard and harder for people to look at evidence as a way to break through on gun safety policies. But what we're seeing that's encouraging is a lot of innovation, particularly at the state level, in trying different policies. So we can now, pretty effectively compare state A to state B and say state A adopted these 5 policies and there are far fewer deaths because of that. But we're making up for a quarter century of not enough research.
So you are, at the end of the day, somewhat optimistic these days?
I live in hope.